The future of vocational education and training has to be based upon a stronger focus on knowledge and understanding, because the nature of higher skill work is obviously going higher up the skill chain. If we were really saying it's vocational education, we would be very much thinking about what we would call the transferable skills, but also the transversal skills, literacy, numeracy, across life and across your working career.
Welcome to another episode of Relearning Work, where we dive into the future of learning and work. In each episode, we bring you conversations with leaders from industry and education to challenge assumptions, propose ideas, and share learnings as we all navigate this world that is being reshaped by agentic AI. Now, whether you're an educator, a student, or a business executive looking to stay ahead in this rapidly changing landscape, there is something here for you. I'm your host, David Yip. My guest today is Craig Robertson, the founding CEO of the Victorian Skills Authority and one of Australia's most influential voices in vocational education reform. With recent keynote experiences at National Skills Week 2024, RMIT's Earn and Learn Industry Forum earlier this year, and his leadership of the groundbreaking Vocational Education Training VET Qualifications Reform Design Group, Craig is at the forefront of transforming how Australia trains its workforce for the future economy. Drawing on over 30 years of leadership in the Australian government, focused on schools funding, employment services, and vocational education training, plus his tenure as CEO of TAFE Directors Australia, Craig brings unparalleled expertise to the challenge of modernizing our skills system. His current reform work tackles the critical issue of redundant training content, addressing over 5,000 units of competency that share 70% of their material, while ensuring Victoria's workforce is ready for clean energy transitions, AI, and other emerging industries. Let's dive into his vision for a skills-led economic growth. Welcome to the show, Craig.
Thanks, David. Appreciate being here.
Thank you. And now, before we dive into what's going to be a really good conversation around skills, but can you just share some of your background? How did you get here? You've had a long history in working in government, and a lot of it with education, right?
It's quite ironic in some regards because as a second-year university student, I was booted out in WA because I did everything else bar study. And so at that point, the West Australian Institute of Technology, now Curtin University, was well placed to say, Craig, I don't think this is for you. So that got me then looking for work, and I ended up through a circuitous route, ending up being a public servant and then it was really just by a variety of circumstances. I ended up in the education portfolio, and then from there I worked in, as you said in the bio, did a fair bit of work in schools funding, a little bit in higher education, but then I sort of landed in a spot that I loved, which was vocational education and training. And one of the reasons I love vocational education and training, because it's not straightforward and it's a bit like peeling an onion, right? You can never sort of get to the truth. And I reckon over however many years I've been working in VET, I've been trying to peel back all those onions to try to get to the truth. The other thing around vocational education and training is it's sort of, it is that bridge between what's going on in work and where work is heading, and for those people who need those skills and knowledge to be able to be successful, including those people that have been dislodged out of work because of technology, but those people that really haven't had a chance in work before. So it's really got that strong inclusion flavour to it, which is what sort of keeps you at it, in my mind. And I think if you speak to quite a few people who've been in vocational education training for a long time, possibly even longer than me, which is hard to believe, it's that human dimension, right? The success that can come to people by activating them in terms of what industry needs, but also giving them the sort of the knowledge and skills really to not only to attach themselves into work, but to build their career.
There's a lot happening in this space, absolutely, not just in Australia, but around the world. And you're known as one of these leaders that is really looking at going back to first principles and questioning some really practices which has been ingrained for a long, long time. It's served us well, right? But may not serve us that well moving forward. What are some of these things that you're really looking into right now?
Yeah, well, so just to go back to why am I trying to look at different sort of approaches, in a couple of roles that I've had, both working for the Commonwealth Government, but also when I worked for TAFE Directors Australia, I got a chance to do quite a bit of international travel and to basically compare countries' approaches to vocational education and training. And I remember even the first trip I had, which was to Buenos Aires of all places, and I was a young public servant and I was going over there and saying, well, Australia knows best, we are the best, etc., etc. And I'm so glad I wasn't the first speaker, because I reckon I would have been booted out for such arrogance. But as I heard other people speak about their approach, okay, that's sort of similar but different and things like that. And you then start to realise that other countries have got strengths, they've equally got weaknesses, and you can start to think through about, well, what is it that should be the basis of how Australia approaches it, particularly qualifications for vocational education and training. We do have to think differently about, as a country, how we need to modernise in many respects. Yeah.
And thinking differently is something that we all have to do, but it's really hard to think differently, I think. And a question that I ask all my guests is, because thinking differently requires getting into the right mindset to think differently. And getting into the right mindset requires really understanding some of the base assumptions that we all are making as we go about our work and everything else. Some of these assumptions we know, but a lot of them we actually don't quite know or are unconscious of, right? So what do you think are some of these assumptions that we are making? Perhaps we have forgotten that we are making these assumptions. That's really guiding how we look at things.
So let me start in particularly vocational education and training. The first thing is, we use the term competency quite a lot, and we think we have got a lot of similarities with Europe. But in large part, we don't. For mainland Europe, they use the term competence. And the notion of competence is around the whole being sort of having competence for work and life. In Australia, we've used the term competency, and many people think they're one and the same, but our notion of competency is a definition of the task that is required in a workplace. And so that's where in VET we get this notion of competency, and we define lots and lots of competency. And
there's heaps of them, right?
There is heaps of them, and you could keep on going, right? And as you say at the beginning, that has served us well, right? Because when we first introduced competency, we were a country that was beginning to say we want to open up want to bring down our trade barriers. We want to open Australia up to global trade. And they recognised at that particular point in time that if it was reliant upon someone's bit of paper, in other words, had they been to university or whatever, for an industry that was going to be basically closed because they just were not going to be able to compete internationally, we need to recognise the skills of the individual that they've probably acquired more through work experience than through a qualification. And what do you have in work? You acquire skills, you acquire understanding. So that's where the notion of competency came from. And it had its strong origins in looking after the transferability of the individual. Our slight problem now is that we've moved from a process manufacturing country to more of a knowledge-based and services-based economy, and processes are not like manufacturing processes in many parts of the economy, and you need a different way of framing that knowledge and skills that are required, and therefore teaching it. So that's a little bit of that's the first thing around this notion of competency that Australia has held on to for dear life for such a long period of time, and then looked at what other countries do. And of course, I've referred to the European construct, and they would have more what they call a generalised vocational education curriculum, for want of a better term. That's preparing a person for an industry and a broad career. Then some of the criticisms that sometimes can come out of that, well, they're not actually ready for the job that I need them to do, right? Whereas Australia's gone slightly different way and said, we're going to focus on the needs of the occupation, and then having that person almost being job ready from day one. And so that's what's given rise to a whole pile of specification. And so we're sort of caught between these two extremes if we compare Europe and Australia. And somewhere in between is sort of the solution in my view. But of course, AI and digitization is going to put that on steroids. And that's going to be sort of the real trick that we've got over the next couple of years.
Because with AI and this whole digitization wave that's happening, one wave after another, things are changing so rapidly that by the time you actually define and specify what skills you need, it's probably going to be irrelevant or it's changed again. The goalposts are being moved constantly. How do you even keep up with that? What's the sector going to do?
So that is something that I hear all the time. And at one point, one federal minister who was new to the system, I heard him on a video call saying, "Oh, well, I'm going to dictate that vet qualifications change every 3 months." Well, there's about a 18-month process in updating even a unit. And so you could almost just imagine everybody would just be in this constant state of churn trying to change a training package. Now, teaching and learning just does not work like that, right? Teaching and learning is a linear process. It's an analog process, really. And if you think through most curricula that plays out in education sectors, it's stable and it's refined over time. It's not flipped every 3 months. So we do have a challenge when we're trying to do that. So then how do we tackle that? And the way that we really need to tackle it is to actually absolutely flip our mindset and say it would be better for people to have a good understanding of the knowledge that underpins a process and a broad range of skills that then gives them the ability to adapt themselves as technology or work processes adapt. And that's the knowledgeable workers are the ones that can keep abreast of what's going on and can manage the adaptability that's required in a workplace, and that's what we need to be able to do. So when it comes to things like digital, it's a really interesting question that we've got when we go to digital. And I'm going to go a little bit, I'll take us down that pathway if you want to.
Please do.
So when we come to digital, so the first thing that we think about when we come to the notion of vet and digital work is we frame everything around the needs of a occupation. Now, I would imagine occupations in the tech industry are pretty fluid and they adapt as technology comes down. It changes work roles, distribution of work responsibilities and the like. So firstly, vet quals are not well suited for the tech industry, which is so volatile in terms of its occupational structures. So that's sort of issue number one for us. Then issue number two is, as a competency system, it has a strong focus on demonstrating the ability to do the job. Now that makes sense where there is, personal safety or safety for users of the services out of vet come to play.
Like electricians and plumbers.
Electricians and all of those sorts of things. All of that is incredibly, incredibly important, which is why you need all those assurances built into vet qualifications, and you frame it around a particular occupation. Digital's just not like that, right? Now, you can get the situation where there are some people who are, I guess, in some ways, are natural digital workers because they've grown up with the technology stack all their life. They have that way of thinking, and away they go. They can adapt and away you go. Now, possibly a university degree has helped along the way, but equally there are others that have just picked things up. And so then what we need to think about is how do we make sure for those people who come in, particularly through the vet pathway into the digital workforce, have sort of the underpinning knowledge about how these things are, how technology tools are framed and operate, and what keeps them working, right? And then possibly how does them... Now, that's not going to be around by saying, well, here's this bit of kit, I'm going to teach you that in its specific. Here's another piece of kit, and I'm going to teach you how to connect. Because, of course, by the time you've done all of that, The thing has moved on. So we've got to go more to what is the underpinning sort of knowledge or things that make these things operate. Now, in many respects, that would be sort of a maths logic type background.
Mm-hmm. So would you say they're transferable skills that you're trying to cultivate, or they're transferable knowledge, or is it one or the other?
Yeah, so we're going to get ourselves caught into some problems with definitions, and this is part of the problem around the world, right? So when we say, but you are right in using the term transferable skills, because at the moment you can run the risk of having a skill that pertains to a piece of kit, and maybe you've done that over a long period of time, and possibly over that time you've understood what the principles that it operate under. What we're trying to say is, let's teach those principles about how these things work. And it's when you have that understanding, those principles, that you can be innovative and you can adjust. You can adjust yourself. So there's a bit of a natural limit in the tech industry of competency. There's got to be more around the knowledge element of how you go about that. And we've traditionally not been a very strong sector about building the base, maths knowledge, science knowledge, and the like. For example, we have quite a number of first or second year electrical apprentices drop out because all of a sudden they've got to understand quite a bit of maths, quite a bit of science, Ohm's law, and the like. And that's something of a struggle. But equally, I've heard other stories and examples where some TAFEs in this instance have said, I'm actually going to bring in quite an experienced senior secondary science teacher to teach the tradies, the apprentices, the basic underpinning physics or whatever that underpins why you do things in a particular way, let's say in plumbing or electrical and things like that. So we've got to be more deliberate in giving people the underpinning knowledge that frames is essentially what practice is that VET has always historically celebrated in Australia. Yeah.
It sounds like, just hearing you describe it that way, that VET is moving into kind of like this higher education space. And I know the higher education space is moving into like the VET space. Both sectors are kind of, the lines are blurring between the two.
You are incredibly perceptive there, Dave, because you are dead set right. The future of vocational education and training has to be based upon a stronger focus on knowledge and understanding. That doesn't mean it becomes like university learning. But then if I went and spoke to higher education professionals as well, of course, most higher education is applied in some way. And so this is the issue that's going on, because the nature of work or higher skill work is obviously going higher up the skill chain, and that's that's why VET's sort of bleeding into what we traditionally would have thought would have been a higher education experience.
And in fact, and for my overseas listeners, in Australia, there's a reform process going on, and the vocational education sectors and the higher education sectors coming to have this harmonization process. But it's important, though, and it was raised at a few conferences, that harmonization doesn't mean homogenization. It doesn't mean that we all have the same thing, right? It just means that we make those two quite complementary. So for the benefit of the student, for the learner shouldn't have to get stuck in all the red tape between the two sectors. And, it's hard enough to learn all the material, let alone try to navigate the process.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And just to help for international visitors, our higher education system is quite similar to all higher education systems around the world, framed really around fields of education, strong focus on scholarship, strong focus on acquisition of knowledge. But as I said earlier on, there's a strong applied element, because our higher education system has been said, the policy has been we want people to be supporting economic growth. So that's where higher education has gone. Most other countries around the world, particularly in the Southeast Asian region, but also in the Americas, Vocational education and training, in large part, is similar to higher education. It's just at a different level.
Yep.
Whereas other countries have this high vocational education framed around the needs of industry and particular occupations. And so that's why, and therefore it's been seen, sometimes can be regarded as, well, it's lower level than higher education. And sometimes, because the two learning systems don't quite line up. Competency is the ability to show that you can do something. Higher education, and this is a gross generalisation, so apologies to any higher education person who will be offended by this, but it's demonstration that you've acquired knowledge, you've got a scholarship, you've got ability to continue to learn. But and so therefore the national policy here in Australia is what they're calling tertiary harmonisation, because a review that was done was handed down in 2024 said that Australia's economic future is going to need roughly 80 to 90% of our workforce with a post-school education of some form. Now, at the moment, we've probably got about 40 to 50% of our population, working age population. So we have a
lot of work to do.
Agenda. Correct.
Yeah.
And you can't just say, I'm going to put that all in the hands of universities. And equally, you can't say, I'm going to put that all in the hands of vocational education and training. So it's really about saying, I've got to bring the power of both those sectors together. And then equally, we've got to avoid what we'd call wasted learning. So if indeed you had some good learning in vocational education and training, why do you need to repeat it when you get to higher education? But we have a problem there, of course, because, as I said earlier, higher education is framed on scholarship, fields of education and knowledge. VET is on, you can show that you do this, and what your knowledge is assumed, and therefore it's not framed, and therefore it's very hard to articulate between the two. And that's part of the challenge of the tertiary harmonisation agenda that's going on in Australia, but that's got a long way to go, really. Yeah.
And part of this whole process as well, there's a big body of work around skills taxonomies, which is, I guess it's a fancy way of saying we need to get the language of skills right so we can understand each other.
That's right.
We can't do all this good work if we are fundamentally speaking different languages.
Yeah. So I just wanted to go, before we go on to the taxonomy work, I did want to say in the context of tertiary harmonisation, and I have said the term a bit, it's almost like vet renaissance. So for 20 years in Australia, vet's always been regarded as sort of the poor cousin to higher education. And many households have said success is going to university as opposed to going to vet, and many ministers of vocational education and training have found that difficult to deal with. But now, as we think about the economic priorities, particularly for Australia, but these are global priorities, right? Most countries are suffering from a lack of housing. Most countries are saying, I'm wanting to rebuild my energy systems and my energy distribution systems. And most countries are saying, I need a care workforce because I've got an ageing workforce in the range. They are primarily areas that are prepared through high quality vocational education and training. And I suspect there are many countries that are regretting the overemphasis on one sector compared to another. And that's where tertiary harmonisation comes from. But equally, I wouldn't want that to be seen as, oh, well, that's university taking over everything, and I wouldn't accuse universities of actually wanting to do that. But harmonisation is what's the needs of the economy and what's the relative strengths of each that are preserved. But then, as I said earlier on, how do we make sure that there is a common language between both of them? Now, that'll get us onto the skills taxonomy work, right?
Yeah.
So the little bit of the history of that in the Australian context has been the federal government several years ago developed the Australian skills classification. And in essence, that was really harvesting a lot of information off the internet from job ads and the like, and then codifying that against what was at that point, and probably still is, the global standard for understanding what are tasks or skills within an occupation, called ONET, which is out of the US Department of Labour, right? And that then started to give rise to the skills classification. And what was interesting in that context also, a lot of people say, but it's a lot of employability skills that help somebody, that really bring skills to life. So in that classification, they had essentially 10 key competencies at 10 levels. And those key competencies are literacy, numeracy, teamwork, problem solving, things like that. So that was the mix. Since that time, and the organisation that did it said, look, this was an experiment. We are one of the things we've got to think about is that's difficult for public servants to think through is what used to be done by hard labour, phone calls, engagement and all that sort of stuff can be done like that by accessing data, sweeping data, analysing data and doing it in a different way. So what goes on is really this can give almost a real-time view of what's actually going on inside the labour market and what skills are growing or what ones are diminishing and the like. Whereas we would have had very laborious processes of engaging with firms and things like that. So to a certain extent it was, here's a reflection of what's going on in the labour market. It's possibly a stronger reflection rather than the facsimile that we have through skills definitions in VET, which we've historically thought as competencies. So that was step number one. Then there was a bit of concern that it was a bit static, that skills classification. In other words, didn't quite reflect proficiency. Or other elements that give rise to skill effectiveness. And so that's where the skills taxonomy notion has grown inside the Australian polity, for want of a better term. And so there's a bit of work going on to try to figure out how do we do that skills taxonomy.
It's a really difficult piece of work because it's a moving target. As you're trying to define this and bring clarity around the language, and people are inventing new skills all the time.
Yes.
The minute you try to define one, then all of a sudden 10 more pops up, and maybe different people describe the same skills differently. Or where there's little nuances for their particular company or their sector. How do you even reconcile this? Because it's a constant moving target.
So, and look, I rapidly move outside of my any sense of expertise that I have in this regard, right? But I think that notion of saying these things move on does bring you back to how do we define and what do we think about skills? So the power of going to a taxonomy is to be able to say, let me understand the component bits that lead to that. Whereas traditionally around the world, whenever we've done a skills thing, we've said that's the outcome, and I don't care what's the predecessor to get to that outcome. A taxonomy, if it's done right, and this may not be able to be done, but it says, okay, these are the elements that contribute to. So what a taxonomy then allows you to say, let's think about the component parts. And so we start to get into, when we talk skills, we start to talk about their component parts, which may well be not only technical skills, psychomotor skills, but cognitive skills, social skills, self-management skills, learning skills, and even foundation skills. And
what
that can give you a sense.
Adaptability skills, which is going to be super important now.
Correct. Right? Yeah. So I often, when I worked for TAFE Directors Australia, I used to sometimes use this analogy. I would always want an experienced mechanic to give me advice on my car, because they could hear a noise and you could see them going, it could be that, but that's connected to that, or that sort of thing, right? Rather than someone who's just sort of read a book and got a Bachelor of Arts. Not that a Bachelor of Arts is bad, but there's a lot of interconnectedness that needs to to come into play. But if we just said skill is ability to hear a noise and figure out what it is, that's a very difficult thing to do. And that's why they often say in this digital world, you need problem-solving skills. You don't teach problem-solving skills, but if you understand the mechanics of an engine, its fuel source, etc., you can then become that problem solver. And that's almost similar to what we need to be able to do in the digital world, is my view. Which is why when we come to skill, we need to think about what are its contributing parts. Now in VET, we tend to, because of a variety of policy reasons, we've said, no, we're only focused on the outcome. We sort of don't care what that pathway is to getting that piece of outcome. But that pathway is critical, right? When you don't go and offer care in aged care without any basic understanding of the basis of care, etc. So that's sort of where the power of a skills taxonomy could get to. But I've wandered off a bit because you're also asking the question, well, there could be an Australian skills versus European skills versus a North American skills. That's a very interesting one, actually. We've done some work with looking at the ESCO, the European Skills, Competencies and Occupations Index. And we've tried to do a bit of matching. And we know that Singapore, for example, is doing some work on skills. Clearly, Australia is doing some work on skills. Interestingly, New Zealand is moving to essentially skill standards for their vocational education and training system. So somewhere they'll be defining skills, right? So you are quite right that we'll all be having slightly different dimensions to it. I'm not as worried by that, provided that it's done in such a way that eventually data will take that over. Would be my view. But we've got to get there conceptually, I think, and we're all struggling a bit conceptually.
I think, definitely the concept part, and this is the challenge for government and the people directing the strategies. Maybe the answer is try not to define it too granularly, right? Go back to first principles and architectural approach, those kind of things. Otherwise, we'll end up having millions of definitions and weekly updates to definitions.
And that's interesting, right? Because when we come to skills in vocational education and training, we sort of think at the same skill, but a different level of proficiency depending upon what level in the AQF this thing is. But the skill's the skill. But we're going skill plus level of where it's expressed, you're creating double complexity there because it's one time, you're compounding the complexity of it. Is it better to go, let's get to the nub of what the skill is? Remember I said foundation, psychomotor, cognitive, etc. And then let's think about, can we have an efficiency measure? So you get to skill, and proficiency can be a second order element to it. And so maybe that's the way to try to think about it.
Now, obviously, it's super important to have skills taxonomies and a skills-based approach. There's a lot of talk about skills first, right? And to change maybe hiring processes or how you get promoted, or just the whole career pathways from one being experience-based or job titles and things like that, CVs, to being skills first. Skills first is still a relatively new concept. How would you even define what skills first means?
So what I suspect has gone on, and I'm not going to be using the Australian context here, but I think globally, is there's a couple of things. We have framed education and therefore educational outcomes in the form of qualifications, basically in the mindset of the education or the vocational education and training system. Australia VET is slightly differently, but nevertheless, that's what we've done. We've also done through that, we've segmented really qualifications for particular job roles. We've actually then said, we've then created gaps, because the education side can never keep up with what's going on the industry side. And we've also created artificial categories, right? Which is why we end up in the whole pile of skill shortages. Some very much legitimate, just can't get enough skilled people. Some of them may well be just generated by the nature of how education and training is structured. And then that's been, we've had that since, we've had this for centuries, right? Here's the way that we frame teaching and learning, and the nature of qualifications is deeply embedded in our psyche. We have a qualifications framework because it helps us understand how far someone's gone up the qualifications tree, right? It creates this sense of standing and the like. But then industry's over here going, oh, hang on a tick, I'm trying to grab hold of innovation. Gee whiz, my business is more technology based, or it's interpersonal based. I need leadership, I need innovation, etc. That often doesn't fit with what has been the output of an education system. And so that's why you've said that you've seen, and there's been companies that have come in and done this quite well, right? Well, actually, what is the skill that you need in these people? Why don't we talk about the skill rather than the qualification? And so that's where the notion of skill has given rise from. And so really, is it the case that employers wanting a different level of differentiation or granularity outside of a qualification to help them make some employment decisions, but equally think about how do they adjust their workforce for new skills that are coming? And then if you overlay essentially easy digital platforms for learning, you are seeing a lot of non-formal, essentially commercial learning platforms being developed that are flexible, convenient, and so you're seeing employers saying, well, I'm going to use that because it gives me that flexibility that traditionally I haven't been able to get from our education systems. Now, does that mean we toss out our education systems because of what's going on the industry side? That would be an unwise thing for us to do because we all need that base knowledge and skills somewhere along the line, because you can't rely upon it solely within a firm whose aspiration is to be adaptive and commercial. So you do need this system of doing that. Should we chase and convert everything to skills in our education system? I'm unsure on that. I would tend to say no. I'd go, let's make sure that there's a good educational experience, that it's equitable for everyone. Then how do we leverage this notion of micro-ceds, informal and the like? In fact, what's interesting is I was reading it on the weekend, the OECD has just put a report out last month on what is the trend to skills first hiring and sort of promotion within industry. And it talks through all of these particular elements. But it does say, and I think if I get the figures right, there's probably only about 20% of employment based on skills hiring. Qualification is still dominant. And I suspect the qualification will still remain that way, but there'll be more skills attributes added. Or what you might say is, I've got this qualification and these are the skill attributes I bring with me based on my learning. And that may well be the way that we get better matching. And then I just think skill systems, skill sort of approaches will proliferate across the labour market.
It's very much, it's not that either this or that, but it's actually very much and, right? So it's not university or vocational. It's not skills or knowledge. It's actually both. What I'm hearing you saying is people need to acquire what's required for their context. And emphasize on being adaptable. And now I really liked something that I heard you say at an event that I went to. And which really goes to this notion of and, right? It's, you were saying we've got to get away from this, our verticals and get into the horizontals. Can Can you elaborate a bit more about that? What you meant by that?
Yeah. So, and this was particularly in the context of the vocational education and training system, not only in Australia, but this is a criticism of most vocational education and training systems around the globe, particularly those that are competency framed. You end up with this very tight vertical bit of learning that's all designed towards the outcome, which is an occupation. And we end up with, I'm aiming for that occupation, but the time I've developed the course, taught the course, got the person to the end, that occupation has sort of moved on. And you go, oh, well, I better start again. And we just get ourselves like a bit of a sort of a mouse in one of those wheels. We're just sort of trying to chase ourselves. But that's sort of aspect number one. And then part of the problem there is we tend to focus on the process of the job, the outputs of the job, etc. And we sometimes forget about what are the common aspects. What's the underpinning knowledge, as I've said, etc. What are the things around communication? What are the things around teamwork, problem solving, and the like? And technically, what we end up doing is we can maroon a person in that job, even though they may have those other aspects, right? But we don't overly celebrate them. So what we're trying to say is let's think slightly differently in when we prepare people for. Prepare people through vocational education for an occupation and then a pathway. I would really like to make the distinction, and we sometimes lose it here in Australia, is we're called vocational education and training. Is it that we have vocational education, which is about preparing somebody for a vocation, and then we have training that's part of the system as well? So in other words, subparts of that vocational learning allows you to do a particular task. Our problem in Australian VET is we've let the training overtake the vocational education, and that's the other aspect, right? So remember, if we were really saying it's vocational education, we would be very much thinking about what we would call the transferable skills, but also the transversal skills, this notion of literacy, numeracy, digital skills that you are transversal across life and across your working career.
The other thing as well, and just going back to the beginning about assumptions and everything, by going really deep, vertical, skills in an area, isn't it you're assuming that young person or whatever going into this field that they really want to do this, but in actual fact maybe a lot of them are doing it because they think they want to do it, right? And or they'd be recommended by a sibling or the parent or a friend, and they'll go about it and invest a year or two or three, and then realize they don't like it, or they're not good at it. So from that point of view, I think this just focus on the vertical side is doing a disservice. We should give people more opportunities for the horizontal piece for discovery.
Correct. So, and to give you the context for why we've ended up here in Australia, out of our Australian qualifications framework, we've essentially, around the vocational element of that framework, which is essentially the first 5 levels of our 10-level Australian qualifications framework, they are framed around essentially the level of autonomy expected in a job. And so, why you do just enough training to get you to be a certificate 2, which is really you're working under a lot of supervision and within tight frames of control, right? And that was framed that way because Australia really went down in our economic historical terms about saying, and people who are old enough will, whether we want to think about it as a result of sort of the neoliberal global experiment, or whether it was the outcomes movement, which essentially in public administration was, I'm trying to do public administration to get me an outcome in terms of impact, and I don't overly care about the pathway to get there. And so we've ended up with our particularly vocational education training, framed around an outcome. And most outcome education systems around the world have sort of been discredited in the end, because it either gets to a very narrow path to what that outcome is, or equally, defining that outcome in general terms you can never do. And so you end up, well, I've got to subdefine, then I've got to subdefine again, and you end up with this huge long list. So there's actually a challenge in that outcome. And then we say, well, I'm only just giving you enough to be a certificate 2. And many people think, oh, that's good because you're starting on your learning journey. But in theory, that certificate 2 is for a very low level job. So it doesn't help you go. A lot of people would say, well, start a certificate 2. You can be exposed to what the industry is. You can decide whether you like it. You decide whether you've got some affinity with it. Then you could say, but I've got that base knowledge. Where can I take it to next? It's what they call in educational terms, I call it knowledge progression, right? It's the classic liberal form of education, where we learn something and we build on it, we build on it, we build on it. And that's sort of the notion that we've got to try to bring back into our, particularly in the Australian context, into our vocational education and training. So, for example, if I was ever to go in and have brain surgery, I would want to be able to make sure that that person who is going to be my brain surgeon finished year 12, did science, did anatomy, so he's got to that point, he or she has got to that point based upon this progression. Now, we have elements of that within our vet sector, but we don't overly have structures that help build that as a standard core for us. Or if we do have it, we have too much complexity around it, and people just lose sight of, well, what's that qualification for? What's that qualification for? What's that qualification for? So that's what we were trying to look at in the vet qualification reform design work that we were doing is, let's simplify it. Let's pull that complexity out. Someone can come to a qual and do it, complete it, and see the value in it for them. And say that value is, it can get me to here, but it gets me on a ladder to these variety of things. So that's what we're trying to do.
So I guess wrapping up a little bit, can you paint, let's say you had a magic wand, fast forward 10 years into the future. What's Craig's vision in a perfect world? How would it look like if you had the ability to shape something that allows people to be adaptable, to have the right kind of taxonomies, experiences which build knowledge and skills, fully harmonized universities? What would that actually look like?
So,
big question to finish.
Why don't we go to the fully harmonized? I would have a conception of post-school learning in Australia having a whole pile of micro creds that you could almost argue are training. You're doing bits and pieces for a particular task required in the labour market. And then you have really, in between vocational and higher education, you have a progression. And it's called vocational education and higher education, not vocational education and training, because I've ditched training out of that and I've said, here is a learning progression. Then I'm saying, remember I used the term vet renaissance, where technology is going to take us is, what was the previous cognitive thinking work, coding work, etc., that was strong in any economy and any firm? Sure, some of that's required, but not in the volume that we need it now, because that's being done elsewhere around the world through global platforms and all of that sort of stuff. The real, what I'm calling the vet renaissance, is the person who has the knowledge, understanding of technology and how it hangs together, but then equally understanding of systems and people. That know how to apply technology for a firm or for a particular outcome and the like. So you're not going to be doing a lot of that. There's still going to be cognitive work, right? But you're not going to be doing that cognitive work that is cutting code as much. You're going to be doing integration work and all of those sorts of things. And in other parts of the economy, you're going to go, I'm going to be leveraging all of that technology and all of that sort of stuff to help me, so I can do good interpersonal work. I'm going to be that empathetic. So I'm going to be that empathetic care worker, etc. But I'm going to be far more effective at doing that because I've got a whole pile of technology that is assisting me doing that. And then I therefore want different elements of learning to be celebrated. We've often just celebrated the cognitive, and we then come down to the psychomotor in terms of craft. We just need to be able to think about a different continuum on that, and therefore we completely celebrate that knowledge which underpins skills. We all have it, we all use it, and the like. And that's celebrated as, therefore, this is the basis of someone who's come out of vocational education training is not a second-class worker, but is an equal-class worker compared to someone who's come out of higher education. There can still be levels, of course. That's not a problem at all. Not everybody is going to be a PhD plumber or PhD electrician, and nor are people choosing that. But what we are saying is that person is not just a rote operator. They are a data operator who then knows how to adapt as technology goes, and that will require the vet sector to really turn itself on its head and to see how it can play its role. So that's how I see it, and we're going to have to empower and activate people so they can be confident about the future that they have and the future that they can play, and therefore potentially be confident that AI is not going to take my job. AI is going to help me be far more better at my job. That's how we need to be able to try to think it through, I think. And possibly that's not 10 years ahead, that's possibly 5 years ahead if you think about what the impact of AI is going to be. But anyway.
Or even sooner. Robo-taxis are already a real thing. It's not science fiction anymore. So,
yeah, that's right.
So, this thing is going to hit us a lot quicker than we expect.
Yeah.
So I guess the last thing is a much more personal question,
Yeah.
and it's what drives Craig. What brought you here today? And I think our teachers have had a huge impact to that. So I would like to ask, who was a teacher in your life that's really shaped who you are today? Yeah.
So it was I wish I could think back to primary school or to secondary school about that experience. I wouldn't have viewed myself as a very good student, and in fact, as I said earlier on, I dropped out of uni. But when I first, a little bit after joining the Commonwealth Public Service, I was lucky enough to be enrolled in the Executive Masters of Public Administration, which at that point was a new program to build public sector capability. And I was in the first cohort of that. And I remember being in a course in Wellington, New Zealand, and it was on arts policy. And I sat back and thought, because I'd thought there'd no way that I could ever work in arts policy, right? But halfway through that course, I sat back and said, actually, I'm being given the toolkit to be able to think through how to do arts policy. And it was at that point that went, okay, here are some different tools that you can have to think things through differently. And so that for me, that way of thinking. And then I had a incredibly supportive boss. In fact, I had dinner with him last night, a bloke called Jim Davidson, who was also trying to explore things. And he gave me quite a lot of freedom and encouragement, but equally within bounds to be able to try some of these things. So I sort of think through those elements, and then I've never really stopped trying to, as I said, get to the bottom of what VET is. So that's sort of what. So it's that ANZOG experience that really triggered me.
Fantastic. So that the fire for this transformation mission.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Now, the last segment of the show is more of a fun one. It's plugs. and it's an opportunity to plug, a company, an initiative, a person, or even a thing or product, whatever you like. So, Craig, what would you like to plug?
Okay, so this is going to be a company, and it's called Australian Elite Education Technology Proprietary Limited. It's being set up by a gentleman called Brian Zhang, and he sets up relationships between China education institutions and Australian education institutions. I often get involved a bit when some delegations come to Australia, and particularly that have come from, say, the Chinese vocational education and training sector. And I try to say, here's how to think about the Australian approach, the Australian way of doing it, so that it helps them understand how to translate it back into the China experience. So my passion is really international education development, and this will sound really, really strange, but when I retire, I have got a passion to go and do some work in Pakistan. My wife is not overly pleased with that, but I've done some work in Pakistan in the past because it's access to education that helps communities, individuals, households, and countries and we've never quite sorted that out in view. Our international efforts have been quite poor in that way. We've often tried to say, take on our Australian vet system into your country and all will be well. The basic lesson around vocational education and training is unique to each country. And so what are the principles that you take and help those countries? And so that's really been driven by some of those international trips that I've had. So anyway, that may come to nothing, but that's sort of what I'm trying to, that's what I'd really like to be able to do, because if we get those countries productive, they become consumers of the goods that we produce. So it might be a bit of an ulterior motive, but fundamentally there is a diplomatic and economic benefit out of trying to do it. So,
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's the philosophy behind that. I like to call it doing well while doing good. We're on a mission for impact, doing impactful things, and there'll ultimately be some good incentives that come out of it too. So everyone wins. So,
that's right. That's where we need to get to in the world, because if we end up with a global, I'm going to sound terrible using this term, but a poor Gini coefficient, in other words, a poor distribution of wealth, that is not good for the world, and it's not good for a particular country. And human capital, human capability is going to be the way in which we can start to, I guess, stabilise what is at risk across the globe, but equally distribute in a fairer way the spoils of technology.
Yeah, fantastic. And what a great way to wrap up this episode of Relearning Work. Thank you so much, Craig, for joining the show and sharing your insights and this complex world that is skills and transformation and vocational education. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in this episode. We will see you next time.